On the surface, it looks like it's just a bunch of girls trying to be thin. And that's what the behavior leads you to believe. But underneath the behavior is this sense of not being good enough. It's an insidious disease because it's so relentless. It really is. It's a distraction from what the real issue is, which is self-worth, self-love, the lack of it, and trying to fill that hole that you have because of the lack of self-esteem. When I was in my early teens, I think that was when I really started heading in that direction. It had been pointed out to me by some of my friends at school that I had put on weight. I became very self-conscious, and I was at the point where I really felt like it was out of control. And I remember going home and crying and deciding I'm going to do something about this. And so I set out on what initially was a very healthy path in increasing my activity level and decreasing my intake, and got so much attention for doing that that it just kind of fueled the perfectionist's fire of taking it to the nth degree. And I got to the point where I was exercising about 5 to 6 hours a day and trying to get away with just eating one meal. It was an all-consuming process. When I think back at the amount of time and energy that I put into that, I can't imagine how completely consumed I was by it. I would feel very much in control when I was doing my exercise and when I was able to restrict my intake. But if I got on the scale and found that, a pound had been gained, or that I wasn't maintaining the way I wanted to, then I would become very self-critical, very self-loathing almost. I had always been the kind of person that drove myself to the point of doing the absolute best I could do and then still not being quite satisfied, because I always thought there was, improvement was possible, and if I wasn't doing my best, I wasn't satisfied. It is not uncommon for young women who are seen as being high achievers, being, very well behaved, very intelligent, very productive, as being the people who develop this type of disorder. And it doesn't seem to make sense to other people. But it is about that pressure that we put on ourselves. And it's about feeling like even though everyone else is seeing how we are accomplishing things and achieving things, to us, it's never enough. We're always focusing on the fact that we're not perfect. And so our focus is on how we're falling short. I measured my worth as a person with, it was equal to what the number on the scale was, which is kind of ironic when you think about it, because the idea was to keep diminishing the number on the scale. And I went from about 140 pounds down to at least 90 pounds before my parents really saw how desperate it was getting, because I was very good at covering up my bones with extra layers of clothing, which is a technique that anorexics often use because they don't want it to be brought to other people's attention when they start to look like they're too thin. You do not see yourself the way other people see you. And so when you might be getting really bony thin, you might not recognize it. Other people will before you do. And so you want to avoid the criticism and having it be pointed out as a negative thing. One night when my mom reached over and noticed that my bones seemed to be kind of jutting out through the sweat clothes I was wearing, and so she lifted up the back of my sweatshirt and she could count all of my ribs in my back. She could see all of my ribs and my shoulder blades jutting out, and she was horrified. And so the next day I was in the doctor's office, and I was told that if I didn't start putting on some weight, I would be put in the hospital and be force-fed. And of course that totally freaked me out. I didn't want to give up that kind of control after having worked so hard to lose as much weight as I had. And so I started trying to eat to gain some weight, to basically to get them off my back, not because I felt like I needed to at that point, but I had kind of lost touch with what normal eating was. I was trying to eat to gain a little weight, but then I would overdo it, and then I would feel this incredible sense of guilt because of having worked so hard to lose the weight in the first place. And so I started to develop the habit that a lot of anorexics do, and that is to begin to purge. And so it moves from anorexia to bulimia. And you can kind of convince yourself that there's not much wrong with you as long as you're strictly anorexic, because you know that everybody, I mean, our culture is consumed with the idea of diet and exercise and, you know, being thin and all of that. But when you move into the bulimia, you know that there's something off kilter, that it's not normal to binge and purge, that it's not normal to, you know, maybe steal things from the store so that you can binge on the food that you're taking. You don't want to pay for it, or you're stealing laxatives from the store or something to help you get rid of what might remain after you have, you know, tried to binge and purge. So there was a lot of about the bulimia that I knew was strange and bizarre and wrong, basically, in my way of thinking. And that was when I realized just how out of control I really was, because I couldn't stop the cycle that I was in. And it gets very scary and very frustrating, because you try and you fail, and then your self-esteem continues to plunge even further, because no matter what you do to try and get out of it, you keep on failing. And so you see yourself as a failure all the time. I remember pounding myself in the head, you know, and just kind of beating myself up, because I could not see any way out. I remember that feeling of desperation. It was a secret. It was a very private hell. I do remember kind of almost praying that I would die, because I felt so trapped and so hopeless. When I first started to have my therapy sessions with the doctor that helped me, he pointed out to me that what I really was doing, if you looked at it, you know, as objectively as possible and over the long term, was that I was slowly committing suicide. And I had not seen it in those terms. I had to make the choice, do I want to live or do I want to die? And if I choose life, I have to create an identity for myself that is separate from this identity of exercising and dieting and being the thin person, and because that's who I had become. I had to be willing to let go of that without knowing what I was going to replace it with. And that's a very scary thing to do. It just became kind of a discovery process of my own, trying to find what that was in my life. What could I discover about myself that would reveal to me my own sense of value and worth? And it was a journey. It wasn't an immediate thing. It was a process of discovering things about myself that I really felt were valuable, and nurturing those and building those up, and leaving behind the things, the perfectionism that would constantly remind me that I hadn't measured up to what I had thought I should be able to do, and appreciating the things that I did do. When I was finally at the point where I could say I'm recovered, I looked back at my life and I thought, wow, that was about a 10-year period that I just wasted, you know? I really kind of thought, I really deprived myself of a lot of living through the course of this disorder and this struggle. But then I realized I can actually use the things that I've gone through in a redemptive way to help other people. And that's when I wrote the book. My book came out in 1982. It was called Starving for Attention. And it was the first-person account of what it is like to go through an eating disorder. It really helps to be able to talk to somebody who knows what it feels like, what the thought processes are, what the behaviors are, what the mind games are that you play with yourself, and yet at the same time be able to kind of say, oh, I don't think that what you're telling me is really the full truth. You know, I can kind of call the shots and say, you're not being completely honest with yourself on that one. But it also, there's just a rapport and a trust that develops between two people that are at different places on the same path. I think what I try to point out is that, first of all, it is possible to recover, that it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be immediate, that it's going to require a commitment, but it is a commitment that you can make each and every day. You don't have to look at the overall mountain that you feel like you're going to have to climb. Just take this step today. And if you can get through today, then that's great. You're a step closer. And the next day when you wake up, take one more step. And before you know it, after you've taken enough of those steps in that direction, you begin to look back and see how far you've come, and it's pretty amazing.